been a busy year for tech giants, no doubt, who've been scaling up their capacity as the world works from home. Digital transformation is really exciting, but there's a lot happening underneath the covers of these platforms that seem to just magically scale up and let people be productive remotely. We're changing how we connect, but also how we secure our online selves, because as more and more of us are online, we have a larger and larger attack surface. And given the scope of the pandemic, healthcare is a particularly important focus for technology to support the hospitals that are having to ramp up, to support medical services and telemedicine and so on. So we thought it'd be a good chance to have a conversation with people who know that world really well. Up next, we have a conversation with Google Cloud's Managing Director for Public Sector Canada, John Cousens, who has been a long-time supporter of this show. In fact, Forward 50, I just called it a show. It does feel like TV, John. In fact, back when we started Forward 50 in 2017, you were literally the first person I called and said, hey, John, with this crazy idea to run this global digital government conference. It's great to see you back here. And John, you're going to be joining us with the former U.S. Assistant for Cybersecurity, Jeanette Manfra, and the former Health and Human Services Senior Administrator, Denise Winkler. So I figure we want to talk about security, we want to talk about healthcare, and we want to talk about scaling and technology platforms. Then I figured it would be a great opportunity to bring Denise and Jeanette on here. I'm not actually seeing them on my screen right now, but I'm going to assume that other people can. So both of them look frozen, but I see them at the bottom of the screen here, so I'm assuming we're going to get that back. How are you doing today, John, while we figure out the technical issues?
I'm doing great, and I'm really happy to know that I'm one of your producers.
That's right.
So that we'll have to talk afterwards on what that looks like financially.
You don't want residuals from this production, but it has been great to line up some leadership stuff, and I think this was a challenge for us in past years to really get people to understand the leadership aspect of this, because so many people think that they have a person for technology, especially at the senior levels. Like, I don't deal with tech, that's someone else's thing. And one of the things that I keep coming back to, and this conversation I had with Paul Glover really resonates, is that when we have digital, certain things that were hard are now really easy, and certain things that were easier are now hard, right? And because this changes, we have to fix the context of how we decide what a risk should be. So, for example, if there's if you want to, like as Jeff Jonas talked about, you want to prove who someone is. In the real world, I can just go, that's you, and it's easy. In the digital world, it's very hard to do that. On the other hand, if I want to personalize something, it's really easy to personalize in digital, hard to do it in physical. But it doesn't feel like government leaders have really internalized that, and that they're working for a tech company. So you, as someone who does work with the tech companies, and we're just figuring out in the background here how to get to Denise and Jeanette on this call, because obviously technology doesn't always work, but if it did, we'd all be out of jobs. So John, you've worked for a number of very big, like large scale tech firms. When, I said this morning that government employees are actually working for a big tech firm, they just don't know it. Like, if you work in government today and you woke up and all of a sudden you were working for Google, that would be a very different experience, right? And so if you were to wake up the next morning and you were working for a company like Google, in your experience, what's the biggest difference between the way that something like Google works and the way that some employee in the public sector works?
I would say, just because I've been around it for probably, if I do the math, over 25 years, it's a governance structure. I think if you look at the technology industry, it's really become decentralized, and looks like we have our two stars of the show here now.
Hi, Denise. Hi, Jeanette. So, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, both of you, now that you're joining us, about the contrast between working in, I joked this morning that government employees don't know they work for a big tech firm yet. Like, they haven't gotten the memo, but they do. I mean, both organizations are dealing with, privacy and security and all these other things. Clearly, the government employees haven't realized they work for big tech. They just do, right? I mean, they have the same, they're playing with information, they're managing security, they're scaling out distribution. The parallels seem pretty obvious, but we still talk about digital government. It should always be like we're talking about government, and then there's this other thing called analog government that that's the exception, not the rule. And both of you, Jeanette and Denise, have been in the tech world, but also in the public sector world. So maybe you can give us some insights into what that's like. Why don't you, Jeanette, just give us a quick background on who you are, and then Denise will go to you, and we'll bring back John in a second.
Sure. So as I mentioned briefly, I was the Assistant Secretary for Cybersecurity at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, which was my role was very similar to the Communication Security Establishment in Canada. And I see my camera's frozen, but hopefully you can still hear me.
We can still hear you.
Right. So you can just look at this awkward picture of me. So I think that I do think you're onto something there. I will say that I was in many ways pleasantly surprised at sort of how a lot of the work that I had done in government. I was in government for 20 years, both within the Department of Defense and at Homeland Security, and really in Homeland Security building this cyber defense organization. And a lot of the work we did when it came to ensuring that we were protecting the privacy of citizens' data, and ensuring that we had the proper controls in place, making sure that the security of the data that we were protecting was in place, as well as building and maintaining very complex systems, and then trying to modernize that. Very similar problems to what people are dealing with in commercial side as well. So I definitely think you're right on. I think there is an interesting transformation happening culturally in government, particularly as you start to bring in younger and more digitally savvy employees that have an expectation for a certain type of digital experience and engagement when they're working, and so in addition to all these security and other pieces, there's an increasing need for government to be able to provide that level of whether that's collaboration or mobility or those sorts of things that the growing workforce is expecting.
Awesome. So, Jeanette, we're going to ask you to reload while Denise answers that question. As we said this morning, this is actually the first technical glitch we've had, which is, I shouldn't have said that, knock wood. So, Denise, I read a horrible story about somebody relying on Excel and an old Excel file, and that Excel file had like 65,000 rows. And so, and for some weird reason, each chunk of data was 4 to 6 rows of that data. In your experience with the government healthcare services, is there a reliance on brittle systems like that sort of more elastic things? Like that was a Google Sheet, that's not an issue if it's BigQuery or whatever. Is there a reliance on those systems, and what's making people wake up to that and fix it?
Well, yes, absolutely. I think we would all be shocked at how antiquated, in many cases, the infrastructure, the computing infrastructure is for government. I know that in the federal space, and certainly in the DoD space, the defense space, I think they have kept up. But when you're looking at, for example, healthcare or social services, which is desperately in need today with COVID and the impact of COVID worldwide, we have this enormous number of citizens who have never had to engage in any type of social service, desperately need that support right now. And those systems we've discovered have been just terribly brittle and terribly inflexible. And they haven't had the ability to respond to this really unprecedented demand for service, crashing, just shutting people out, shutting down. And so I think we would all be shocked. I have to say, when I worked for government, I was an administrator for Health and Human Services for a good more than a decade. And the interesting thing is the states that I worked with and for are still using some of the systems I used when I worked there. Okay.
Oh yeah, I saw somebody made a mainframe work on a Raspberry Pi the other day. Like slowly, but it worked. But there's still something like that in a basement everywhere, running COBOL or Fortran, and yeah, real issue. So I want to leave the three of your conversation. It's great hanging out, but I will be right here if something else happens. appreciate your patience while we smoothly handle these transitions. So over to the three of you, but I'll be here if you need me.
No, thanks, Alistair. We may hit the bat phone again and call you back if we have another little crash. So thanks for that. And I think we're live. I've got everybody's video and audio working. So I'm going to jump into a couple of quick things. And Denise, this is great to have both yourself and Jeanette here. Just two incredible talents that, when welcome again to Google and in the time we spent together, it's been amazing to be able to have the privilege of working with both of you. So following up on to Denise, on to Alistair's question, what have government agencies and their dedicated teams done to cope with this? What have you seen out there in the last 6 months on being able to really cope with the whole dynamicism of the changing environment on a day-to-day basis from technology, and what's forced them to try different things?
Well, I think COVID and the sheer increase in demand on government services as a result of COVID have forced government to have to deal with outdated infrastructure because they simply couldn't handle the volume. Many of the government agencies that I've talked to and worked with in the world,
and by the way, if they go to Google and say
have had 1,000 and 2,000% increase in the volume of citizens coming through and needing their service. So some of the things they've done, which, my hat is off to these folks, because literally they were not only were the citizens in crisis, but the agencies were in crisis, and the employees, they wanted to do their best to serve their fellow citizens and were hampered by really very inflexible systems. So they've done some really interesting things, like standing up intelligent agents, doing contact center AI, and standing it up in the cloud. And Google was able to help because we were able to do it in days and weeks, not months. But being able to handle that influx of questions and automate in very quick order, automate some of those routine tasks so that you would be able to have your citizens or be able to have your employees work on higher volume, higher complex issues. Quickly modernizing front ends or web portals. Again, realizing that they could stand these things up quickly, put them in the cloud and scale them up so that they could handle the volume. Things like using Google Meet and teleconferencing like we're all doing here and have been doing, like I've been doing from my office in my house, being able to deliver services to citizens virtually. Everything from telehealth visits to being able to teach your children, being able to mobilize your workforce so that it could work virtually. Standing up even remote desktops to enable that have been part of what they've done. And I also think too, again, looking at what can we automate. So being able to automate processing of applications and verification documents, anything that was routine so that their limited staff and other limited resources could focus on helping citizens. I've been amazed at how creative and open to trying new things that government has been. And then with Jeanette, just to end this thought, the other thing is with all this money that has been pushed out to help citizens and help businesses, we've also seen a tremendous uptick in improper payments and fraud and fraudulent activity coming at these systems that, again, were very old, legacy, inflexible infrastructure. I think I read an article that said we're fighting modern day fraud with 70s technology.
That's a great transition. And Jeanette, you served under 3 presidents, so you've seen it all. What are your thoughts on looking at some of those improper payments and your experience having been right in and around everything government security? And how do you remove security as an enabler, as a blocker, and make it an enabler?
Yeah, and I think sort of building on the conversation we're having with Alistair and Denise said is, well, a lot of the work that we did in my previous role was around establishing security sort of baselines, and in building, really trying to do is think about the government, the federal government, as a broader enterprise than had previously been thought of, in the notion of risk sharing across different agencies, and sorting through how that actually works and how we can get people up to that level of security. And really quickly, the modernization conversation becomes such an important part of it. And I think Alistair mentioned, Fortran, COBOL, that's like a real thing. And the amount of money that the government, and of course I'm most familiar with the US government, but had a lot of great work with the Canadian government and others, so I know most are in a very similar position, is the amount of resources that agencies have to spend just to operate and maintain this legacy infrastructure. And they get sort of caught in this kind of challenge, right, of how can I kind of separate myself from having to operate and maintain this very critical these very critical systems, but at the same time be able to put those investments towards the modernization. And so it's a very difficult challenge in the US. We tried a few things around the Tech Modernization Fund and other sort of initiatives to try to get there, and to try to impress upon that, this digital transformation goals that we have for government is not just about being able to reduce cost, although that's a very important thing and important to taxpayers, but it can also improve security. We believe it can actually even improve your compliance, and you can have more transparency into what is actually being done to secure that. But most importantly, it can really deliver better services, and it can reduce the fraud. The amount, the dollar value of improper payments is just enormous in the US government. And being able to bring all of those modern capabilities into the delivery of government missions and services is just so critical. But it's really hard to navigate as an actual practitioner in the government, responsible for sort of balancing all of these different things and never having quite enough resources, and being asked to accomplish about 30 different priorities in an incredibly difficult timeline. Without either the monetary resources or the human resources. And so I've kind of taken away a few things that I learned in the government, and really was a lot of what attracted me to Google too, was how to think about digital transformation as a security leader. And oftentimes security is seen as the blocker, and nobody wants to engage the security team because they're just going to slow things down. They're just not going to allow me to get the tools that I need to do my job. And that can absolutely be the case sometimes. But what I've learned is that if as a leadership team, CIO, CTO, CISO, however sort of the positions that are established, and really having the leadership of the agency head is very, very important. Because it's not just the technology that you're trying to transform, it's the operations, it's the culture, it's the delivery. And so if you can think about, from a security leader, it's not a risk avoidance. A lot of I just want to avoid all risk. I understand this, it's painful right now, but you know what? I understand it. I know what my perimeter is. I've got these tools, and I know that, and I don't want it to change. So we say, instead of taking a risk averse, sort of posture, take a risk informed. Understand the pros and the cons of what digital transformation will offer you. And incredibly, what it also offers you is more security insights and tools. Then really think about zero trust. Zero trust can be such a powerful way of modernizing your own security operations, while at the same time building it in a way that can deliver real mission results to the various agencies that you're trying to support. And I will say, zero trust is not easy. Google's been on the journey since 2011. And so we've done a lot of really cool things to make it seamless as a, sort of an employee to engage. But so understand what it is, understand your goals, but really drive towards that zero trust. And then I would say automate as much as you can. Automate. We have too many security professionals doing manual labor that is can just be automated. And so highlight what can those be, what things can be automated, put those in place as a part of your overall strategy, which leads into the next part, which is the reskilling of your security workforce. You've really got to, early in the process, and your agency leadership, the CIO, people need to understand that in order to fully capture and to bring security and compliance requirements on board, reskilling and understanding, either reskilling or bringing in new talent, is very important to understand that early in the process. We went through our own modernization, and there's a lot of security folks are sort of start to become concerned. They don't understand how to use the tools in the new environment. They don't understand how to make their sort of traditional compliance goals in these new environments. So you've got to bring these people along with you and really offer them the opportunity for career growth. And then the last thing I would say is you've got to develop a very transparent and close relationship with your cloud providers and vendors. And, you know, we at Google, and I know this is the same for others, is, you know, this is a shared risk. And we need to have insight into the risk posture of our customer, and you need to have that insight into our risk posture. And we need to have a continued dialogue so that we can ensure that we're helping you achieve your broader digital transformation goals while modernizing your security. So those are kind of the big lessons I've taken away from both my 10 months of experience at Google and my experience over at government.
So, Denise, what would be some tips for people? You've walked a mile in both shoes now, on lessons learned, what to avoid, what traps to avoid. So, really kind of focus on the success and the enablement that we're talking about today.
Well, when we talk about digital transformation, I think that from putting on my government lens, we tend to think it's all or nothing. Like suddenly I have to go poof and update my whole infrastructure and modernize my whole infrastructure. And that can be a very daunting thing for any official, but especially daunting for a government administrator. Jeanette is absolutely right. You have 30 priorities and you have enough resources for maybe 5. And so I think the lessons learned, and I think what COVID has taught us actually, and I think it's shown government administrators that the power of cloud and the power to digitally transform can be done incrementally, and it can be done really successfully incrementally, because you can see, for example, being able to do things in shorter sprints, and you see value right away. And what you're doing is you're not wasting your financial and human resources on these very large multi-year transformation where everybody forgets what you were trying to accomplish a year and a half into it. So I think that also that cloud has shown us, especially for government, we were not prepared for this demand, for this level of demand, not on the healthcare system and not on the social services system, and certainly not in the labor system. The systems weren't prepared to handle it. And I think it has really shown us how important it is to think about scalability. I mean, it's very easy to say, we'll think about digital transformation next year, or that's on the to-do list later. Being able to scale up and scale back to meet the demand, and certainly to be able to do it efficiently and effectively, is critical for government agencies, especially those that are serving citizens directly. And I think that cloud has really shown its value in this environment for government, and shown them that there is a way to incrementally modernize and to do it quickly and to do it in iterations. So I think it's really shown its value.
Jeanette, and thanks, Denise, and Jeanette, you've now had a cloud first policy in the US for almost a decade. You've had a front row seat to see the evolution of how security in your world intersects with that digital journey as that enabler. So, I'm going to switch it up a bit, but give us some thoughts of what you've now seen in the decade later on the lessons learned you have and where it's matured from and some of those successes.
I think it's not as far along as, we would absolutely wish that there was greater cloud adoption and more successful kind of broader digital transformations going on in the federal government. There are really great success stories. Particularly in the most interesting ones, I think, are in the smaller agencies. And they just go all in and they say, you know what, I've got this. I understand the scope. I understand the mission. I'm going all in. And so some of the most innovative type stuff is actually happening in the small agencies. Where it starts to become a challenge is in the really large agencies that have been kind of over the decades glommed together. And they have all of these sort of like highly federated legacy systems that they're trying to manage and hierarchy and all of that. I think my own personal experience too, and I think this is relevant to Canadian government, if it, sort of, because there's similar kind of roles and responsibilities. In my agency, we were responsible for, setting security policies and implementation guidance, and then providing security services to other agencies. Some of them were voluntary, some were required, and historically, in many ways, we had sort of just said, well, this is it. This is the way you're doing it. And then we would spend a lot of years arguing back and forth on either the engineering or the legality and all of these and pieces of it. And in particular, when it came to modernizing our security policies and services, when it came to cloud, it took us a really long time to sort of provide that guidance. And now, my former group, they're putting out great stuff now. Trusted Internet Connection 3.0. I think there's a lot of great stuff in there. But it took a bit of a step back where we said, okay, it's not the exact technology that we want to just say, okay, let's just move it over to the cloud, because that doesn't work. It was, what are the outcomes, the security outcomes that we're trying to achieve, build partnership with everyone that we need to throughout the entire government, and then start to build the use cases and the reference architectures and all of those things to enable cloud with the security outcomes that we wanted. And I think that was really important shift for us.
Well, that's a great experience to be able to bring to the table in this conversation. Actually, I'm getting notes here that I think Alistair has a boatload of questions for the two.
I do, and I'm totally going to bogart your meeting. This is fantastic. It's great to hear these sort of war stories. I got to say, I think you're underselling cloud. Digital government is not cloud computing. Digital government seems to be, I'll give you two examples of the superpowers of digital government. One is a time machine, right? If you don't like something, you can roll back. And I joke that if I deploy a battleship and it's the wrong battleship, it's very hard to roll that back and deploy a different battleship tomorrow, right? Rolling things back in cloud or in digital is a time machine. You just go, no, I want to go back to the old version. But it's also a cloning machine. I can say I want to build two versions of this that are slightly different and see what works. Mm-hmm. Those are cultural changes. That makes a public servant a different species in terms of their tolerance for risk, their desire to experiment, how they think about costs, buying a capital asset and depreciating it versus an ongoing cost where you're paying by the drink. So I think you're underselling it when you say cloud, but how do we get the public service in which both of you have worked to become this new species that sort of understands that cloning and time machines are a reality, if that makes sense? That's a big question. So Denise, why don't you try it first? Or Jeanette, go ahead.
Yeah, I can start. And give Denise time to think about it. So I love the way that you frame that. And it is so true. I believe in the power that cloud brings to digital transformation, but the digital transformation itself is so much more. And the biggest thing that I think government misses when they're trying to go through a digital transformation is they miss the cultural and the operational side, and they just focus on the technology buy. And so some of the things that we had done that are still in process is think building an entirely different workforce model. We were very focused on the security professional side of it. But we spend a lot of time, and we got a special sort of authorization from Congress to be able to do this, but to build a completely different professional series that was based off of the model of how tech companies bring in developers and engineers, and it really we were building is to reflect the reality of the technical workforce, and to incentivize them. In the previous conversation that I was listening in on, is there's the people that, they love the idea of I'm saving lives, or I'm helping somebody get access to social services that they never would.
Or like Jasmine, I'm getting rid of forms.
Yeah, like they love this. I mean, people in our immigration team who just like spent all this time modernizing the ability to apply for immigration, they just were like, they loved it. And so there's so much of that passion and talent. And so what we had to do though is really think about a new, what we call accepted service, but build from the ground floor up. And the department is now just starting to hire, I believe, some of those first candidates. And but it's not just the technical people, like you said. You've got to think about everybody on the mission delivery side as well, and maybe not deep into the tech, but that they are still a part of this digital transformation.
So no quick fixes. How about you, Denise?
Gladly.
I think, and I think we're close to done, but I'll make this quick. I think that a couple of things. I think that citizen self-service and the citizens we're serving today have a completely different expectation of government than what government is able to deliver. And so I think that citizens are going to drive government to digitally transform how they do business. I also think, though, because Jeanette has worked more at the federal level, where I've worked at the state and local or territory or region level. And here in the U.S., and I know this is true across the country, the federal governments tend to put a great deal of constraints on state and local government and how they can buy, when they can buy. And I think that we have to look at how do we support digital transformation at the local and state and citizen delivery level. It
does also feel like some of the civic tech movement stuff, like the Code for America, can be this like third level between government, private sector. There's this civic tech where it can sort of take experience. I remember talking to Jen Polka, who was the original founder of Code for America, and she said, well, the first thing she said was necessity is the mother of acceptance. One of us said that, which I thought was a great line for 2020. And the start of this session was certainly an example of that. But I think that this idea of civic tech tries stuff out, and then when it's so unbelievably obvious that this needs to be in government, you can almost shame the government into then adopting it and scaling it. But I'd like us to get beyond shame the government into proving it can be done to a point where the government tries to do it, I think is, a real challenge. So that is all the time we had for this. Is a fantastic conversation. John, as always, thank you so much. You've been a real champion for this conversation on digital government. I think it's amazing to say that with your support for this event and with Google supporting the conference as you have done, this has turned into the world's largest gathering of digital public servants, and we're thrilled that you were able to join us here today, and there's lots more happening on the platform. So if any of you have questions for Denise, Jeanette, or John, obviously you can go into the partner section. You'll see Google in there, but you can also send them messages, and we've got another 5 or 6 days on the platform to have those conversations. So thank you all so much for joining us and being patient as we got the technical gremlins worked out. It's always, the bar is pretty high when Google's on the phone, so we're glad we were able to make it work.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys. Thank you so much for having us.
Thanks, Denise.
And I'm going to bring back my co-host, Jacqueline. Jacqueline, how you doing out there?
I'm doing all right. I'm having a really great day. This has been fantastic stuff, Alistair.